My name's Ethan,
I'm Ben.
I'm Kabir.
and welcome to our 21st episode on My Matters.
Today we have a very special guest, Sam Savin, a licensed clinical social worker and a youth social worker at the JCC. I know I sort of introduced you, Sam, but do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sam Savin, licensed clinical social worker, like Ben said. And I have been at the J a little over 4 years now. And so there, my role is a couple of things. I work in our preschools. Um, I work with our teens also. I have a teen mental health committee there that Ben is on. I work at our Apache day camps, hiring our social workers and being on site at our camps. So really anything that has to do with youth or teens and anything that space, social, emotional, child development related. I'm a part of that team, and we have some more people on our team of year-round social workers as well.
Nice. So, my first question before we sort of dive into our topic today, which is the state of teen mental health and advocacy, sort of a big topic and kind of what this entire show is really about. I want to learn a little bit more about you or have our viewers learn a little bit more about you. So, what got you interested in social work and psychology?
Sure. So I have struggled with depression and anxiety since middle school. And back then, I really didn't have the language for what I was feeling or going through. My parents were very supportive people, but I didn't feel comfortable sharing the really dark thoughts that I was having. So I think that silence kind of really shaped me and who I was. And so I became really fascinated with human behavior, why people do what they do. And so I've always really gravitated toward kids and teens, probably because I think that's where it really started for me. And adolescence is such a daunting age overall. There's just so much change, so much going on. But I also see it as a huge opportunity for growth and change. So I think that's really kind of what initially got me sort of into this field overall.
That's a very interesting, backstory for why you got interested in psychology or helping the youth, right? So I was kind of curious, like, what were some of the biggest mental health problems or issues that teens were dealing with, over the course of your career, especially, working at the JCC, and what are some of the biggest issues you've seen among teens?
Sure. So I have previously worked in our school system in the city. So prior to this, I was a school social worker. And I was at a charter school in Chicago. So that was ages 16 to 22. So a very different population. So I can kind of talk a little bit about the two and sort of the differences there, because I think they look very different. But once you kind of go underneath, I think there are a lot of similarities. So when I was in the city, that community looked very different from the teens that I work with now. There was a lot more environmental and trauma stressors going on. So a lot of those teens were coming from like single family homes, neighborhoods with really high crime, a lot of incarcerations, teen pregnancy, domestic violence, substance abuse, all of those kinds of things. So their mindset was very focused on survival, making it through the day. Now working in suburban communities, I see very different issues. So teens here aren't necessarily focused on survival. I think in recent years, survival has a little bit come up now that we have so many more safety concerns. But they are really more so crushed by like the academic pressure, perfectionism, identity struggles, social comparison, all of that stuff. So the problems kind of look different, but the pain is really real in both places. And so I think really underneath that, it's still a mode of survival in some sense.
So, what do you think the difference, what are the different like issues that survival might lead to, or identities compared to identity struggles, or more like academic pressures, more survival on like a short-term basis, anxiety on a short-term basis, or compared to anxiety on a long-term basis, like perfectionism, grades, getting into a good school, or things like that? How do those lead to different or maybe similar types of struggles?
Yeah, I mean, I think that over time, really a lot of that kind of sits with you and really affects how you approach things consistently throughout your day and throughout your life. So if you are sort of, and you're not realizing that these things are affecting you as heavily as they do. So with anxiety, it's kind of like, I always kind of think of it like a slow burn sometimes. Like it's always kind of persistently there until you have those big panic attack moments. But you don't realize how much it comes into play, and you don't realize how much sometimes even when you're really struggling with like making a decision and a choice between something, that can be your anxiety coming through just because you don't want to make the wrong choice. And you don't realize like, oh, it's not just because, oh, I'm bad at making like my choices right now. I can't make that. It's just, that can be your anxiety. And like, oh my God, I'm just so overwhelmed. I can't even make a simple choice. I can't even figure out what I want to eat right now because I'm so overwhelmed with all of the things in my world that I can't even though I'm starving and this is what I want, but oh, I have to do this and that and all those things. I think it just persists, and it can really affect over time. Just how do I manage all of those things? It makes it really hard down the road to know how to deal with bigger life things down the road if you don't figure that out earlier on.
Mhm. And in terms of your experience working at the schools in the city, I know we kind of talked about, in a past episode with a professor, we kind of talked about equity in mental health and how some mental health workers, kind of the equity or the balance around that in different communities is kind of unequal. And I just want to ask, was there a supportive environment in the school in the city, and how that really compare to the support systems that we have here in the North Shore?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, as far as resources go, of course, there's not as great of resources or anything. The environment overall wasn't built to handle the depth of what those kids go through and face. They're dealing with generational trauma, community violence, poverty, all of those kinds of things. And so you can't focus on academics when you're going through that. So the system was, intention, it's unsupportive, not by any choice that anyone's making. That is just, that kind of is what it is. It's under-resourced. So, there's a couple of social workers for hundreds of kids. So what do you expect? Everybody only can react to the crises and the fires, and they're not able to help the kid who's maybe silently struggling. And so they can't, address any of those kinds of things. So there are pockets of support. There are individual teachers and staff who care very, very deeply. But the systemic structure does not prioritize mental health at all. And that support, like I said, is really just mostly reactive. There's not a lot of room for proactive strategies or anything like that. I think there are small moments where I was able to do some things that were helpful. Like I tried to implement some positive enforcement, strategies instead of just punishment. I tried to do some things that were proactive and using proactive language and things like that. But it's, once I left that position, that went away because I was the person who did it. So if I wasn't there to run it, then that went away. So I think that's kind of why I do some of the work I do now, is because I do want to build programs where mental health, it's not just an emergency response, it's really part of the culture, and really being able to connect and create a deeper level, at least I hope, of kind of emotional safety for teens and youth.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
really great, and I'm sure you had like a great impact on those kids in that school, and we obviously hope that there can be some progress in the future to make it, like you said, more proactive and less reactive. But
Yeah, I
next
still
question,
talk to some of those students, so I think I
yeah,
did.
yeah, exactly. That speaks to your impact on them. But my next question is really about our community, and
Yeah.
obviously, like you said, there's just naturally more resources in our community, but it's not really a matter of comparison when you're talking about mental health, because there is such a mental health crisis right now,
Mhm.
and it's a crisis that has ascended in magnitude over the last couple of years, like we've seen after COVID, and I guess the question I really have is, do you think that there is a supportive environment in our schools, in our community, not necessarily in comparison to those schools, because obviously there's definitely more resources here, but where it should be in an ideal world, do you think we're meeting that standard? And if we're not, where do you see some of the faults happening?
So I think that schools here genuinely want to be supportive. I think the intention is there. Like you have mental health clubs, you have wellness weeks and counselors and posters, mindfulness posters, things like that. So I think schools want to do that and want to be in the right space. But I think in reality, it probably feels, at least to a lot of the teens that I talk to, that it's often kind of like mental health is being talked about more than around them, really than like really with them. So it's kind of like checking off the boxes a little bit, like, oh, we did wellness week. Okay, good. Now we can move on a little bit more. And so like the culture itself still runs mostly on achievement and in comparison and grades and all of those things. So schools encourage self-care, but the schedule, let's be honest, doesn't allow for it. You have kids packing their schedules tight. They're coming in for early morning classes when they need sleep. All the data shows that teens need more sleep. Um, but kids are being told to prioritize mental health, but also they're taking 5 APs and 2 sports and volunteer and all this stuff so you can get into college. So it's really mixed messaging. So I'd say the support is visible, but I doubt it's always really felt by teens. And so I don't think the message always matches and aligns. There are definitely caring adults in the program, and there are phenomenal social workers and counselors in the programs. But I think there's still a lot more work to go for sure.
Mhm. It's very revealing to see kind of the difference in priorities. I know you were talking before about how in some of these underserved communities you were working in, the pressure of survival kind of outweighed the I guess the prioritization of mental health. And along with that, that kind of sparked my curiosity about how like people in those communities as well as maybe in our community, like what are some of the differences you've seen in how teens perceive mental health, not just how like the environment is shaping their mental health, but also like how they themselves view it, like if there are any like negative perceptions of it that you've experienced, like why do you think those developed, and if not, like I was
Like the teens from that I used to work with, or just teens in general?
just like both actually, just like
Mhm.
how do their perceptions of mental health kind of differ?
Sure. I mean, I think, the teens that I used to work with, I think, and I think similar actually to a lot of the teens that I work with now, I think kind of mental health terminology are kind of thrown around a lot. So like, oh, I'm so OCD, I'm depressed today. Like, that's kind of used very generally. Um, I think a lot of the students that I worked with in the city, they talked about very openly very serious mental health concerns in terms of being hospitalized or things like that. That was quite common. But in terms of actually being really able to say like a real depression where like I can't get out of bed for no apparent reason, not because something traumatic happened, but just I just can't get out of bed. I'm feeling this weight, this heavy weight, and I can't do it. That wasn't a conversation that could ever happen. It really was more so about a trauma or something like that, which is understandable. But I think they couldn't realize or wrap their heads around that there was lingering trauma that they had to deal with. So, terms like bipolar was thrown around so often. Whenever I would have a teen, frankly, come from certain hospitals, I didn't have to look at the paperwork. I knew what diagnosis that they were coming back with because that it was just given out so readily. So I think because that would happen, and they would throw it around. Oh, I'm so bipolar today. I mean, I would hear it all the time from them. And so I think now, working, in this suburban community, I think also the conversation is a lot more apparent. I think we're all more open. It is now okay to say it's okay to not be okay, but only to a certain point. I think it's, we see people on TikTok talking about mental health and athletes and celebrities, and I think that's great. But I think it's still, we don't feel fully comfortable really saying like, I'm gonna break down. I'm really, really in a dark, dark place. I think we haven't gotten comfortable with that yet. And so I think that's where teens still struggle with that piece of it, is really coming out and kind of talking about those pieces.
And you mentioned, throwing mental health kind of like these buzzwords around, right? And
Hmm.
without knowing the full magnitude of it. I feel like it's kind of confusing because, people, when they say like, oh, I'm feeling kind of depressed or OCD, I feel like, it's kind of counterproductive because it may feel like, you're being open, you're saying, how you're feeling, but it might not be the right term, and it might take away from kind of the magnitude of the term itself. So I guess my question for you is, as a social worker, are there times when there are better ways to kind of say how you're feeling besides just naming, one of those words? And like, if so, like how would one do that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we just have to be careful about throwing it around so casually. You never know who's listening. You never know what somebody else has gone through. So I think, as much as we can steer away from a label like that, because it minimizes the reality of somebody else. And so it makes it really much harder to distinguish everyday stress from an actual clinical need. So, instead of saying I'm so OCD, it's like I really like things neat and I get uncomfortable when it's messy. We can just, I know it's quicker and it's feels better to say like, oh my God, I'm OCD. Like I understand that feeling of it. You feel like it really describes it better. But if you haven't been diagnosed with it, it's not an accurate statement. I'm depressed. I'm feeling really down today. That's like just a much simpler way to say it. But if you are feeling those things, or you are saying like, I'm feeling like I might be having some feelings of OCD, then you go and you talk with somebody. You ask a parent or a social worker at your school to say like, hey, I'm feeling these things. I'd really like to learn more about it so I can understand where this is coming from.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, and I'm obviously this is just speculating, so don't take my word for it, but I think a lot of people throw around these terms because first of all, it validates their experiences, but if they can establish a rhetoric around themselves like, oh, I'm so OCD, I'm so bipolar, it kind of takes the place of, getting actual help and going to an actual therapist. And I still think there's just a ton of stigma around therapy. Not to mention, that's more prevalent in our community. But we featured a professor from Northwestern, Renat Betas, like Ethan was referring to. We talked about inequity in mental health.
Mhm.
And there's still so much inequity in terms of financial resources to get therapists. So I think the environment that's been created around, getting actual help has caused people to just say, "Oh, I'm so OCD" or "I'm so bipolar." So I think, I mean, I don't know in the future how that could improve. I don't have the foresight for that. But I think a good solution for people would be to talk, like you said, about their feelings, how they're feeling. I think we're more programmed to understand emotions and feelings and connect with people on that than just throwing around definitions because that's just a game of um, trying to get people's attention, I think. And that's another thing too. When people, throw around these terms, a lot of the times I feel like it's a cry for help, but I think it falls on deaf ears when it's thrown around so many times. So I think talking about feelings um, is better. And I recognize that for those of you listening who are thinking about doing that or reaching out, it's very, very difficult. So my advice would be to find friends who you really, really trust and can open up to about. But the next question that I have for you is how do you think social media, and we talk about social media, how do you think it affects the way teens see mental health? Because a lot of times you do see people on social media throwing terms around, and in many ways, social media has raised awareness for mental health. But I also see some, in addition to just social media being negative, it being a negative on perception of mental health as well.
Yeah. No, I think social media, it's definitely that double-edged sword. So, on one side, teens can find community, validation there. But then they're, comparing themselves to others and watching mental health content that isn't always necessarily accurate. Um, and I think social media has helped push along and some of the ways that we've changed our viewpoint on mental health. So I do think it's helped break down that stigma a little bit more. So I think that is positive. Teens see, their peers or influencers, talking about mental health. And for a lot of kids, like scrolling and realizing I'm not the only one can be very, very validating and just make you feel less alone. So I think that that's great. And, picking up a coping strategy, like a deep breathing strategy or something like that. But when we boil down mental health to like a 5 second, 10-second video or a meme or something, and that's leading to a self-diagnosis or a really, really like shallow understanding of something of a mental health disorder, then that makes you think like, oh, I must have that because I saw that on TikTok, and so that means that I have that too. And teens, as smart as you are, your brains are not fully developed. So sometimes when you see that, then it's like, oh, well, I have that too. Okay, that's me. And so then you identify, because we do at any age, we want to belong to something, especially if you're feeling like I'm feeling maybe like I'm a little different and I don't know where I belong. And you see somebody else that you identify with. So you're comparing your struggle to somebody else, and then you finally kind of see something, you're like, oh, that's me. And so then you take on that identity as well. So it can really kind of turn into this competitive suffering thing also, like who is suffering more, who's, and that can be really unhealthy as well if you're getting into any kind of self-harm, eating diagnoses, like any of those kinds of things can be also very harmful. Because we really can't ignore those like darker corners, kind of like I was talking about before. And truthfully, the algorithms that pick up on these things, it will only push that stuff more and more as you seek it out. And so it's, yes, opened up that conversation, but I think it depends what you're looking for as well. And I think being very mindful, and parents really have to be mindful of what teens are looking for, what they are engaging in, how they're using social media, and not just even, TikTok or Instagram. Like, I mean, ChatGPT as well, using that. There was recently a lawsuit. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. In California, a young man died by suicide after chatting with ChatGPT for a long time. And there was a recent lawsuit about it, and ChatGPT thankfully has changed a lot of their algorithms about this, but it was quite scary, the things that ChatGPT told this teen to do in response to some of the self-harm stuff that he was putting onto there. So I just think there needs to be like a lot of awareness and more regulations are on some of those things, because as media and all of this tech grows, we all need to be more mindful of what content is out there. So parents definitely need to be watching that as well.
I think, the drive to kind of find community online, and, humans come together through shared characteristics, right? And so when, there's a term to describe, some experience that you're feeling, and other people experience that too. There is a real opportunity for community and bonding there, obviously, but, the consequence of that is kind of the spreading of terms that may not be completely accurate, like OCD or ADHD, like people self-diagnosing, kind of diluting I guess, the descriptive value of those terms for actual psychology. And so I'm kind of, you've talked about how, social media can be a double-edged sword in that regard, along with, the changing digital landscape of, artificial intelligence, how teens can navigate that. So, it might seem to many people that this is almost like a very a challenging situation to navigate, especially because everything's happening so quickly. New technology is coming along, and new algorithms are kind of warping teenage minds. And so, in your experience, or like, what do you think some of the best ways to combat that are? Like, just this changing digital environment. How can teens navigate that to kind of support their mental health, even though it's all changing so quickly?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think that it can't all be online. I think you have to have real in-person relationships. I think you have to have a trusted relationship with at least one adult in your circle of people. So whether that's family, whether that's a teacher, somebody that you really feel that you can go to. I think that is so important. And I think that like those in-person relationships are really so valuable. Having that communication skills, really being able to have that I think an online community is fantastic. I do. I think it can be a really great supportive way to, grow your circle. Absolutely. But I don't think it can ever replace that in-person feeling and the skills that you get from that. So I think joining some kind of club or committee or something like that um, is so invaluable. So I really think that just by doing that, you will ultimately feel connected to something. I think you have to feel connected to either something at your school, in your community, in your home. I think that's really the main thing is you have to find some kind of connection somewhere other than just online.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and I think the connection is the most important thing when it comes to combating mental health issues. And it kind of leads into my next question because us three, me, Kabir, and Ethan, and you have something in common, and it's that we lead teen mental health advocacy organizations. You lead a teen mental health committee at the JCC, which I belong to, and it does great work. And I guess when you work in mental health or you do work in mental health, you can feel the stigma, you can feel that people don't want to talk about it, you can feel the discomfort, and you can feel that it's hard to gain traction. And a lot of the times the people that do gain traction are the ones that are spreading more negative content about mental health, like throwing around definitions, because that's what people want to hear. So the ones on the videos on social media that are just, throwing around terms like bipolar, OCD, those are the ones that become popular because people like them more. So my question to you is, in your experience, and this is sort of an advice question to us as well, but in your experience, how can mental health advocacy groups, whether it be online or in person, the mental health advocacy groups that promote actual connection and true sharing of feelings, how can they gain more traction? How can they get more people involved?
So I think it's a tricky question, and I don't necessarily have
So
the
we
answer.
know
If
it's
I
tricky,
did,
yeah.
like I wish I did. I think that it can't be it can't just be like generic things. It has to be really authentic. I think it has to involve teens. That's why I have the Teen Mental Health Committee. I didn't want to be doing something from my perspective only because as much as I might feel like I'm super young, I am not a teen anymore. So I have to have your voice. It has to be social media savvy. It has to be where the teens are. So like for example, like I'm pushing my marketing department to get into the TikTok world if we can. And like I know like that's, we're not in that right now. We're not in that space. Like we might need to be in that space if we want to reach teens. Um, so it has to be creative. It has to be kind of casual at first. It can't be heavy. And as much as this is a heavy topic, I don't think you can go in heavy right off the start. Because I think that that is too overwhelming when you don't have that connection first. So you have to build to that connection. So you have to start from a place where people are comfortable, and then once that happens, then you can build a little bit more and then you can get into that deeper stuff. So it's whatever way, and it doesn't have to be, I think people's definition of mental health and mental health programming, like my definition of it is really anything can almost be mental health programming if you think about it. I mean, like for me, it's everybody's mental health, everybody's self-care is different. So, for you, a walk outside might be your self-care. For me, that might sound like the worst day ever. So it could be a walk, it could be drawing, it could be all of these other things. And so that in and of itself could be a mental health program. It doesn't have to be sitting around talking about feelings, which I think is a lot of people's perception of what it should be. So it can be so creative. It could be something totally different off the wall. It can be paintball throwing, like whatever, like come get your feelings out with paintball. Like it could be totally something just to get them in the door. So I think it can be very creative and approachable just to get people connected. And once you have people connected, then I think you can move from there.
Mhm. Yeah, in terms of advocacy, I know that we kind of talk about how men's mental health sometimes is a little bit less represented, I think, with advocacy groups and kids our age. And I feel that kind of relates to what you said, how a lot of people think mental health is opening up and like, crying and talking about your feelings, right? And that's why I think a lot of men and boys our age are a little bit hesitant to kind of lean into that. But, like you said, it's really important to think about that. Talking about your mental health is just one strategy, right? It can be really anything that just puts you in a better mood and kind of clears your head. So yeah, I just want to reiterate that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, boys, young men are definitely not talked enough about. And like, I think that your perspective is not, brought up in terms of mental health and at all enough. I think, that whole strength means silence and all of that is still very much a stigma that is hard to break. So I think we need more male role models willing to say, like, I struggle too, and it's not weakness and all of that. So I think that is still a really big barrier in the mental health space is talking about mental health with men. There was a really great mini series on Netflix called Adolescence. I don't know if you guys, I know parents watched it. I don't know if teens did, but it was phenomenal. So if there are any parents or teens watching, I highly, highly suggest it. It was amazing. But basically, it follows a 13-year-old boy who's accused of killing a classmate. But it's really not about the crime. It's not like a who done it. It's like why, like a why done it. And so it's kind of the overall question is like, how can an ordinary kid kind of unravel and like through a mix of like the police interrogation and family dynamics, you kind of see this toxic masculinity and social media and this inability to name or share emotions and how it like this slow build to like kind of what happened. And so like why mental health and talking about it with men and young boys is so important. And I just think it was a phenomenal show that everybody honestly should watch. I've told all my friends, like, if you have kids, you are like mandated to watch this.
Mhm. Actually, I do think I've heard of that. I think that's the one where there was an Oscar winner for that. I heard or something
Emmys,
like that.
Emmys. I think
Oh
he should
yeah,
get
yeah,
an Oscar if he could. And
yeah,
they won
yeah.
all the Emmys that they were
Mhm,
nominated for. And it's so cool how it was shot. They did every episode was one take.
mhm.
So like it's really cool.
Yeah, so I think that's a phenomenal point. And the direction of advocacy, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of representation and authentically engaging with communities to truly like interact and recognize their mental health. So I guess my final question would be, where do you see your teen mental health committee going, in the future? I know you've done, Ben obviously has testified to the great work that you guys have done at the JCC, but like, in terms of, going further, like where do you see it going?
I see it growing for sure. I see more collaborations with schools, other organizations, more creative events. I am hoping for more visibility across the community as a whole. Doing more like in-person events at, like festivals or things like that. So I just really hope that there's more visibility overall. And then, I mean, always at its core, it's always going to be really teen focused and teen led. I think that's really what makes it, powerful. But so I would really like to see it over the next couple of years get more traction, like in some of the schools, and yeah, throughout the community.
Yeah, I can I have that vision too for the committee, and I hope. And we talked about the men thing. I think I'm the only guy on the committee, but
Yes,
um,
I want
yeah.
more guys.
Hopefully, in the next couple of years, that won't be the case for other
Yeah,
people. But that's not a complaint. We do, great work, and I'm excited to see where it goes. So that sort of wraps up the episode for today. And I want to thank Sam for coming on the episode, taking her time, and
thank you.
sharing her um, valuable perspective. But before we go, we have a couple announcements. Last week we were featured on Fox 32 Chicago for a segment on their morning news. So you can go on our YouTube to view the segment for that. We're going to have episodes coming out in the future. We're planning one with a neuroscience professor or a psychology professor soon. So that'll be a very exciting episode. We're going to have more high schoolers on to like we have had in the past to help foster the conversation and start the conversation around mental health. So Sam, again, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, my name's Ethan.
I'm Ben.
I'm Kabir.
Just remember, your mind matters.